The year is 1920. In the rugged hills of Gansu province, a region that now borders Ningxia, life moved at the rhythm of the seasons. This was the Loess Plateau, a vast expanse of yellow, silty soil built up over thousands of years by the wind. The hills rolled like waves frozen in time with deposits of sediment, sometimes hundreds of meters deep. For the people who lived here, this soil was both home and hazard. For over 4,500 years, generations had carved their homes directly into the Loess Hills. These cave dwellings, called yaodongs, were marvels of practicality. They stayed warm in winter, cool in summer, and required almost no construction materials besides the earth itself. Families, farmers, and local traders, including large communities of Hui Muslims, had made these caves a way of life. But beneath their feet, the fine, loosely packed Loess soil carried a hidden danger. In an earthquake, it could become deadly, flowing like water and swallowing anything in its path. The region was politically isolated. China was in the grip of the warlord era, with central authority weak and fragmented. The local population had little access to outside aid, and communications were slow. Villagers went about their daily lives unaware that the ground beneath them was a ticking time bomb. December 16, 1920 began like any other winter day. Snow dusted the hills and the air was bitterly cold. Families prepared their evening meals, children played near the cave entrances, and traders returned from the sparse local markets. By early evening, people were settling in for the night. They had no warning of the destruction to come, no sign that their world was about to be reshaped in an instant. In the quiet, cold night of Haiyuan County, the earth was silently storing energy. The mountains seemed eternal, the caves secure, and the snow still. Few could imagine that in just hours, the ground would erupt in one of the deadliest earthquakes in human history. A force so powerful it would literally move mountains and bury entire communities. At just after 7:05 in the evening on December 16, 1920, the earth roared to life. The Haiyuan Fault, a major structure along the edge of the Tibetan Plateau, ruptured with immense force. The earthquake released a magnitude estimated today at 7.8 to 7.9. striking at a shallow depth that amplified the destruction at the surface. The shaking was so intense that it reached the maximum level on the intensity scale: total destruction. For residents of Haiyuan, Longdu, and Huining, the night became a nightmare of collapsing homes and cracking earth. Entire villages were leveled in moments. In 14 counties, more than 70% of structures were destroyed. Families inside their yaodongs were trapped as ceilings caved in and walls crumbled. The sound of splitting earth and falling stone echoed through the hills, leaving survivors disoriented in a darkness broken only by the cold winter moon. The rupture extended for approximately 237 kilometers, or nearly 147 miles. In some areas, the ground shifted horizontally by over 6 meters, tearing roads, bridges, and rivers apart. Even hundreds of kilometers away, tremors caused lakes to slosh and rivers to change course. Reports noted the shaking could be felt as far away as Qinghai province, with some distant observers in Norway detecting unusual movements in large bodies of water. As the initial quake subsided, stunned survivors realized the destruction was only part of the horror. Buildings were pulverized, roads split open, and communication lines severed. Many who survived the collapse of their homes would soon confront another, more terrifying phenomenon. The mountains themselves were starting to move. The shaking was only the beginning. The fragile hills of the Loess Plateau, weakened by centuries of wind-blown sediment, began to behave like a liquid under the force of the earthquake. Entire slopes lost stability, and massive landslides surged down the valleys at terrifying speed. Survivors described it as mountains walking, with the soil and rock flowing as if it were water. The quake triggered more than 675 major landslides and tens of thousands of smaller ones. Entire villages were swallowed in an instant. In Shiji County, the settlement of Sujayahe disappeared beneath a river of Loess, leaving no survivors. Rivers were dammed, creating dozens of new lakes overnight, while other waterways carved entirely new paths through the altered terrain. The destruction of the landscape was widespread and unpredictable. Valleys were buried under tens of meters of earth. Hillsides that had stood for centuries vanished, replaced by chaotic piles of soil and debris. Survivors recalled rivers of mud rushing past in the dead of night, sweeping away homes, livestock, and everything in their path. The scale of human loss from these landslides alone was staggering. Modern studies estimate that over 32,500 people died directly due to these flows of earth. Combined with the collapse of the cave dwellings, the earthquake became one of the deadliest landslide events in recorded history. The mountains themselves had become a silent, unstoppable killer, reshaping the region in ways that would last for generations. For those who survived the initial quake and the terrifying landslides, a new danger emerged: exposure to the harsh winter. The earthquake struck in mid-December, when temperatures in Gansu and Ningxia regularly fell well below freezing. With homes destroyed and food supplies buried or swept away, thousands faced starvation and hypothermia in the days that followed. Aftershocks continued relentlessly for years, leaving people too afraid to rebuild permanent homes. Even temporary shelters offered little protection from the bitter cold, and families struggled to find clean water as rivers had shifted or been blocked by debris. The landscape itself had become alien. Familiar roads, bridges, and landmarks were gone, making travel and communication nearly impossible. In addition to natural hazards, social order broke down. Banditry and theft increased as desperate survivors searched for food and shelter. Medical care was virtually non-existent, and disease spread in overcrowded exposed camps. Relief efforts from the government were minimal due to the ongoing civil strife of the warlord era, leaving survivors largely on their own in a frozen, fractured environment. The aftermath revealed a grim truth. Even after the shaking stopped, the earthquake's impact continued to claim lives. The combination of cold, hunger, and isolation made survival a daily struggle. In many areas, death from exposure and starvation rivaled the immediate toll of the quake itself, extending the human tragedy far beyond the initial event. The Haiyuan earthquake was not just a tragedy of circumstance. It was a perfect example of how geology and human settlement can combine for catastrophic effect. The quake occurred along the Haiyuan Fault, part of a complex network of faults at the edge of the Tibetan Plateau. This region is gradually compressed and deformed by the slow but immense collision of the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates, a process that built the Himalayas and continues to release energy in violent earthquakes. The lowest soil that dominated the landscape amplified the destruction. While dense enough to support cave dwellings, the fine, loosely packed sediment had almost no resistance to horizontal shaking. When the quake struck, the soil lost its cohesion and flowed downhill, a process similar to soil liquefaction. The very material that had provided shelter for thousands of years became a deadly agent of destruction. The earthquake's death toll remains one of the highest ever recorded. Estimates range from 234,000 to 273,400 lives lost. Haiyuan County alone accounted for over 73,000 deaths, more than half of its population at the time. By any measure, it ranks as the second deadliest earthquake of the 20th century, surpassed only by the Tangshan earthquake of 1976. Despite the enormity of the disaster, it remained largely unknown outside China for decades. Political instability, geographic isolation, and the sheer scale of the event kept news from spreading widely. Today, however, the Haiyuan earthquake serves as a critical case study. Scientists study the lowest landslides and fault mechanics to better predict future disasters, particularly in regions with similar soil and tectonic conditions. The event is remembered as the day the mountains walked. Entire landscapes were reshaped and hundreds of thousands of lives were lost in an instant. It is a stark reminder of how local geology, extreme weather, and human settlement patterns can combine to create disasters of almost an unimaginable scale. The 1920 Haiyuan earthquake is more than history. It is a lesson for the present, a testament to the destructive power hidden beneath the earth beneath our feet. It was just after 2:17 in the morning on October 6, 1948, when Ashgabat, the capital of the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic, was struck by disaster. The city lay at the foot of the Kopet Dagh Mountains, quiet and fast asleep, its population of around 150,000, mostly resting in single-story homes made of unreinforced brick with heavy clay roofs. These structures were not built to withstand seismic activity, leaving the inhabitants extremely vulnerable. For nearly 20 years, the fault line beneath the city had been quiet, with only a minor quake in 1929 hinting at the danger. Suddenly, a low rumble from the mountains broke the silence, followed almost immediately by a violent jolt from the ground below. Two massive shocks occurred within seconds of each other, and the entire earthquake lasted only about 10 seconds. In that brief span, the city was virtually wiped off the map. Buildings crumbled, walls collapsed, and streets became piles of rubble, leaving survivors disoriented in the pitch-black night. Those few who managed to escape described a terrifying scene. Clouds of dust obscuring the stars, the sound of collapsing buildings mingling with screams for help, and an overwhelming sense that the city had been hit by a bomb rather than a natural disaster. Emergency response was nearly impossible in the darkness, and most people had no time to react. Within moments, Ashgabat had transformed from a bustling city to a landscape of chaos, marking the start of one of the deadliest earthquakes of the 20th century. The earthquake that struck Ashgabat was not a random event. It was the result of the region's dangerous geology. The city lies on the northern edge of the collision zone between the Arabian and Eurasian tectonic plates. This slow-motion continental collision created the towering Himalayas and continues to make the area highly prone to seismic activity. Stress along the fault lines in this region builds steadily over decades before being released in sudden, devastating earthquakes. On October 6, 1948, the earthquake reached a surface wave magnitude of 7.3. Its focus was shallow, only about 18 kilometers beneath the surface, which meant the energy was barely dissipated before reaching the city. The epicenter was extremely close, just 25 kilometers away, so the shaking Ashgabat experience was almost at its maximum possible intensity. Geologists now classify the fault involved as a strike-slip fault, where two tectonic blocks slide past each other horizontally, generating violent lateral ground movement. The modified Mercalli intensity scale rated the shaking as level 10, described as extreme. Unlike magnitude scales that measure an energy release, the Mercalli scale reflects the effects experienced by people and structures. For Ashgabat's unreinforced brick and adobe buildings, level 10 shaking was catastrophic. Walls cracked and roofs collapsed within seconds, leaving virtually no structure intact. Even public buildings and infrastructure which might normally resist minor tremors were destroyed. The combination of a shallow focus, high-intensity shaking, and extremely vulnerable construction made survival inside any building nearly impossible. When the shaking stopped, Ashgabat had been transformed into a landscape of rubble and ruin. Nearly every brick and adobe building lay in ruins, and entire neighborhoods had disappeared under collapsed walls and roofs. Hospitals were destroyed, leaving the injured with no access to medical care. The railway station was reduced to debris, and communication lines were severed, isolating survivors from the outside world. Heavy freight trains were tossed from their tracks, and the few underground water pipes that survived were critical for providing any water to the devastated population. The timing of the earthquake worsened its impact. Striking in the early hours of the morning meant most residents were asleep inside their fragile homes, instantly trapping them beneath collapsing structures. Emergency response was limited to the few who managed to survive and escape, and they quickly set up makeshift aid stations in public squares and open areas. Despite their efforts, the scale of human loss was staggering. For decades, the Soviet government deliberately underreported the death toll. Initial reports claimed only 10 to 20,000 fatalities, but later research revealed the actual number ranged from 70,000 to 110,000. This represented nearly 10% of the population of the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic at the time. Among the dead were many entire families, including relatives of young Sapir Murat Niyazov, who would later become the first president of an independent Turkmenistan. The sheer magnitude of destruction made it one of the deadliest earthquakes of the 20th century, a catastrophe hidden from the world for decades. The aftermath of the earthquake that should have sparked an immediate international response, but Ashgabat was behind the Iron Curtain of the Soviet Union. In the climate of Joseph Stalin's rule, admitting that a major Soviet city had been destroyed was seen as a political weakness that could not be acknowledged. Reporting on the catastrophe was tightly controlled, and the scale of the disaster was deliberately concealed from both domestic and foreign audiences. The day after the quake, the Soviet newspaper Pravda mentioned only that seismic activity had been detected in the region, offering no information about the destruction or the human toll. International press agencies, relying on Soviet sources, repeated the censored reports, leaving the world unaware of the true devastation. Even the aid that was sent from other parts of the Soviet Union was disorganized due to this enforced secrecy, slowing relief efforts for survivors. Thousands of critically injured people were left without proper medical attention, and it is estimated that nearly half of those suffering life-threatening wounds died in the days following the earthquake because of the lack of care. The policy of silence persisted for nearly 40 years, until the late 1980s, when the Soviet policy of glasnost allowed historians and researchers to access previously hidden archives. Only then did the full scale of the tragedy come to light. Approximately 110,000 people had perished. The deliberate suppression of information turned a natural disaster into a story of compounded tragedy, demonstrating the deadly consequences of political censorship in the wake of a crisis. In the immediate aftermath, recovery in Ashgabat was a massive and brutal undertaking. 4 divisions of the Soviet army were deployed to manage the chaos, clear debris, and provide aid to survivors. Establishing communication with other Soviet cities was a priority, and it took several days to restore radio contact to coordinate supplies and medical support. Despite the destruction, some services were restored relatively quickly. The railway line was operational again within 3 days, allowing essential goods to reach the city. Electricity returned in 6 days, though medical care remained improvised, taking place in open public spaces and parks since all hospitals had been destroyed. Makeshift shelters and aid stations became lifelines for the thousands who had lost their homes. Long-term rebuilding was slow and tightly controlled by the government, which continued to withhold the scale of the disaster from outsiders. Ashgabat remained closed to visitors for nearly 5 years, while the authorities directed reconstruction projects under strict secrecy. Propaganda highlighted the heroic rebuilding efforts without acknowledging the human tragedy that necessitated them. Over time, the city was transformed into what is now called the White Marble City, designed to be one of the most earthquake-resistant capitals in the region. October 6th is observed in Turkmenistan as Earthquake Memorial Day, a solemn reminder of the lives lost and the lessons learned. The 1948 earthquake remains a crucial study in seismic risk management, urban planning, and the enduring need for transparent disaster preparedness. It serves as a lasting testament to the human cost of both natural forces and political secrecy. At 4:17 in the morning on February 6, 2023, millions of people in southern Turkey were jolted awake by a force few humans ever experience. Without warning, the ground ruptured along the East Anatolian fault system, releasing energy built up over centuries. This was not a brief tremor or a rolling shake, but a violent sideways tearing of the earth that lasted roughly 80 terrifying seconds. Entire cities were thrown into chaos before most residents even understood what was happening. The main earthquake measured magnitude 7.8, making it one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in the region. Its epicenter was located west of the city of Gaziantep, in an area where multiple tectonic plates grind past one another. The rupture occurred at a shallow depth of around 10 kilometers, a critical factor that dramatically increased surface damage. Shallow earthquakes transfer far more destructive energy directly into buildings, roads, and people. Ground shaking reached levels 10 and 11 on the modified Mercalli intensity scale, described as violent to extreme. At this intensity, even well-built structures can suffer severe damage, while weaker buildings are almost guaranteed to collapse. Residents described the ground moving sideways in sharp, snapping motions rather than gentle waves. The noise of cracking earth, shattering glass, and collapsing concrete filled the darkness. Within seconds, entire neighborhoods across southern Turkey and northern Syria were reduced to rubble. In the freezing winter night, survivors stumbled outside in shock, surrounded by dust clouds and broken buildings. Communications failed almost immediately, leaving many cities cut off from help. Before the sun rose, it was already clear that this was not just a major earthquake, but the beginning of one of the worst disasters of the modern era. As survivors struggled to process what had just happened, the disaster escalated in a way few earthquakes ever do. Roughly 9 hours after the first rupture, the ground convulsed again, this time with a magnitude 7.7 earthquake centered farther north near the town of Ikanozu. This was not a typical aftershock, but a second major rupture triggered by the immense stress released along the fault system earlier that morning. Any sense of safety that remained vanished instantly. Buildings that had survived the first earthquake while badly cracked now collapsed without warning. Rescue workers and civilians searching through debris were forced to flee as streets split and walls came down around them. The psychological toll was immense, as people realized the ground itself could not be trusted. Many survivors refused to enter any structure, even undamaged ones, fearing another collapse. This second quake marked the beginning of an extraordinary aftershock sequence. By the spring of 2023, more than 30,000 aftershocks had been recorded across the region. Some were strong enough to cause additional building failures, including a damaging earthquake in late February that further destabilized already weakened areas. Each tremor slowed rescue efforts and deepened the trauma for millions of people. The geographic scale of the disaster was staggering. In Turkey alone, 11 provinces were officially declared disaster zones, covering an area home to over 14 million people. This region also included nearly 2 million Syrian refugees who had already escaped years of war. Across the border in Syria, millions more were affected, many living in fragile buildings and informal housing that stood little chance against such powerful shaking. What began as a single earthquake had now become a prolonged regional catastrophe, stretching emergency resources to their absolute limits. As daylight revealed the full scale of destruction, entire cities appeared as if they had been bombed. Across southern Turkey, vast stretches of urban neighborhoods were flattened, with apartment blocks pancaked into layers of concrete. At least 230,000 buildings were either completely destroyed or damaged beyond repair, and close to 300,000 structures were affected overall. In many areas, streets were no longer recognizable, buried beneath debris and dust. The city of Antakya in Hatay province suffered some of the worst devastation. One of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, Antakya lost whole districts in a matter of seconds. In certain neighborhoods, nearly every structure collapsed, leaving nothing but open ground where communities once stood. Historic markets, residential blocks, and public spaces were erased almost entirely. The volume of debris created was almost unimaginable. In Turkey alone, an estimated 100 million cubic meters of rubble covered the affected provinces. This was many times greater than the debris produced by the 1999 Izmit earthquake, overwhelming cleanup crews and slowing rescue operations. Heavy machinery struggled to navigate the wreckage, while narrow streets trapped under concrete made access nearly impossible. Critical infrastructure also failed on a massive scale. Hospitals, schools, airports, and government buildings were damaged or destroyed, crippling emergency response efforts. Power lines were severed, water systems collapsed, and roads cracked or sank, isolating entire communities. Even cultural landmarks were not spared, with sections of ancient fortifications and historic sites collapsing. What remained was not just physical destruction, but the collapse of daily life itself. As rescue efforts continued, the true human cost of the disaster became clearer with each passing day. In Turkey alone, the confirmed death toll rose to 53,537 people. Across the border in Syria, at least 5,951 deaths were officially recorded, though the real number is believed to be higher due to the challenges of reporting in war-torn areas. Combined, more than 60,000 lives were lost, making this the deadliest earthquake disaster in modern Turkish history. Tens of thousands more survived with injuries, many of them severe. In Turkey, over 107,000 people were wounded, including countless victims pulled from the rubble days after the shaking stopped. Hospitals that were still standing were overwhelmed, while damaged medical facilities struggled to operate with limited power, staff, and supplies. Emergency workers faced freezing winter conditions as they searched for survivors, often hearing voices fade away before help could reach them. The scale of displacement was equally staggering. Around 3,300,000 people in Turkey were forced from their homes, suddenly left without shelter, income, or basic necessities. Entire families moved into tents, makeshift shelters, or container cities, unsure if they would ever return to their neighborhoods. Many others fled to distant provinces, becoming internally displaced almost overnight. For Syrian communities, the disaster was especially devastating. Millions were already living in extreme poverty after more than a decade of conflict, and the earthquake stripped away what little stability remained. In northwest Syria, where most residents relied on humanitarian aid even before the quake, the destruction pushed entire populations into deeper crisis. Beyond the physical losses, the emotional trauma left behind was immense, with survivors facing grief, uncertainty, and the haunting absence of loved ones buried beneath the ruins. As the dust settled, attention turned to why the destruction had been so extreme. Experts quickly pointed to building quality as a decisive factor. Turkey had strengthened its seismic building codes after earlier disasters, yet many of the structures that collapsed were newer apartment blocks that should have survived. Investigations revealed widespread use of poor materials, illegal modifications, and weak enforcement of safety standards. The earthquakes exposed how decades of unchecked construction and regulatory failures had quietly turned a natural hazard into a human catastrophe. The disaster also sparked a wave of legal and political consequences. Contractors, engineers, and developers were arrested and charged for negligence linked to collapsed buildings. Public debate intensified around past construction amnesties that allowed unsafe structures to be legalized. For many survivors, accountability became just as important as rebuilding, as families demanded answers about why homes meant to protect them instead became death traps. Economically, the impact was enormous. The World Bank estimated direct physical damage in Turkey at over $34 billion, while total economic losses were projected to exceed $100 billion. In Syria, damages reached into the billions as well, compounding an already fragile economy. Entire regional industries, from agriculture to manufacturing, were disrupted, setting back development by years. Reconstruction efforts began almost immediately, with the Turkish government promising to rebuild homes, infrastructure, and public services on a massive scale. New housing projects emphasized earthquake-resistant design, while urban plans aimed to relocate communities away from the most dangerous fault zones. International aid organizations and foreign governments pledged support, providing funding, expertise, and humanitarian relief. Still, rebuilding entire cities is a process measured in years, not months. Ultimately, the 2023 Turkey earthquakes stand as a stark warning to the world. They showed that even powerful nations remain vulnerable when preparedness, enforcement, and transparency fail. The ground will shake again someday, in Turkey and elsewhere. What determines the outcome will not only be the strength of the earthquake, but the choices made long before it strikes.